One of the biggest challenges that I've seen both in academia and entrepreneurship, which really hurts people, is they presume that they're alone. And that's really dangerous. We are an integrated whole as it relates to our physical selves, our mental selves, our spiritual selves, and our emotional selves. And I think in the end analysis, when we look at our foundation, if our foundation isn't whole, it's really hard to show up for ourselves, let alone to others. How do we get a return on luck? And that, it was really Jim Collins that sort of inspired me then, to ask this very same kind of type of question about our potential and this concept of return on potential.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Mike, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the program. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. Mike, you've been managing a multi-billion-dollar venture firm. You're also teaching at prestigious institutions and are deeply involved in family life. What brings you the most joy and fulfillment in all these roles?
Thank you for that wonderful question. For me, it's all about impact. I want to make a difference in everything that I do, whether it's in my relationships or whether it's in my profession or even my personal pursuits. And I'm a big believer that when I align my core values with the roles that I assume and the goals that I take on myself, then even when I have a lot going on, it's all really a function of joy and alignment. And so it allows me to be in flow and achieve a lot more. So I tend to be pretty intentional and thoughtful about what I aspire to take on and how that really dovetails with the values that I hold.
And as you're talking about values and impact, can you share with us your purpose?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because my purpose differs somewhat depending on the role that I assume or the activity that I'm engaged in. So for instance, I'm married and I have kids. So within the context of those relationships, my purpose is to be as engaged and supportive to both my wife and my kids as possible, and to honor who they are and to help them become the best versions of themselves. And that's how I approach those relationships as an example. Then there's my academic work. And in the context of my academic work, the purpose is slightly different, although I think what you'll see is the core underlying values are similar. And so the beauty about having values in life is that they can be pervasive. And in fact, I would assert that they should be pervasive because those are the things that are really core to who you are. And then we try to find different ways to instantiate those values in the various different roles and activities that we engage in. And so in my academic work, it's a lot about giving back. So I've been fortunate to have had some success and some learnings in my career and in my life. And I want to help support others to achieve their full potential. That's really my passion. If you looked at my LinkedIn description, I talk a lot about return on potential, and we all have extraordinary potential. And what I want to do is enable people to actualize that potential by being the best version of themselves and doing it under their terms. And so my academic work is really focused on that. And you might notice that actually rhymes with the answer that I gave for my family. And the reason that it rhymes, again, is because it supports a common set of values.
As we talk about return on potential, it's also coming down to the energy that you put in specific initiatives and specific pursuits. How do you actually make those choices in terms of what you actually choose to pursue to actually have the most fulfillment for yourself, but also have the maximum impact as you've described earlier?
That's a great question, and I appreciate that. And if I sound somewhat repetitive, it's because I mean to be, because I tend to be pretty systematic about how I think about what I take on. And again, it comes down to really knowing your values. And the interesting thing is, a lot of people, they think they sort of kind of know what their values are, but if you ask them, they'll pause and think about it a bit. And then what I would assert is it's actually equally important to know not just your values, but to have some sense of order. Now, it doesn't mean that if you have one value that's number 2 on the list and another value that's number 5 on the list, that you're always doing 2 instead of 5. It's just more of an awareness of what truly matters to you, what brings you joy and fulfillment and meaning. And so that when you have to adjudicate conflicting opportunities or challenges or situations, you have something to go back to. And so I start with my values, and then I start with the roles. And it's interesting, I take a very similar approach to my roles, which is not only do I know what those roles are, but I have a sense of priority about those roles. And so I know where my wife and my family fits in relative to my professional pursuits, and then relative to some of my athletic pursuits and some of my other personal pursuits. And it's not that some of the things that maybe aren't ranked 1 or 2 or 3 aren't important, but in the end analysis in life, we have a limited amount of resources, be it time, energy, money, or whatnot, to allocate towards the infinite number of things that we do. And so knowing what those prioritized values, roles are, ends up helping us sort of be really informed about the goals. And one other thing that I'll say on that topic, which is interesting, because oftentimes in my classes, people ask me, and in various different interactions, what the optimal number of things to take on. Like, how do you take on all these different things? And how do you not just figure out what to take on, but how much to take on? And the interesting thing is, if you know what your priorities are, it becomes less important, because in the end analysis, maybe you decide you're going to do 10 things or you do 3 things. The real issue is if you allow number 10 on the list to take over what's number 1 or 2 on the list, and then you're no longer living your priorities. And so that's really the danger. It's not just so much how much you take on, but also really knowing in the end analysis what truly matters to you, so that in any given situation when there's conflicts, which invariably arise and sometimes unpredictably, we really know ideologically how we want to address them.
And I want to go back to the values that clearly are extremely important and serve as your compass, as you said, to pursue the right opportunities with the right level of energy and so on. What can you share for our listeners in terms of how to define and how to articulate your values? And can you also share with us how your values have evolved and changed over time, maybe from your younger days?
Absolutely. Now, those are fantastic questions. Maybe I'll start with the first topic of conversation, which is how might we ascertain what our true values are? And the reason I say true values are, we may be compelled by people, whether it's our peers or friends or society at large, to adopt certain values, but they may not be authentic to us. And it's important to really understand what motivates and drives us, and not to be too judgmental about ourselves for being our authentic selves. And an interesting question to ask ourselves, and this is the question that I ask myself when I evaluate not just values, but various different roles and goals, is, does this bring me joy? And do I find this fulfilling? Those are 2 questions that I ask myself all the time, because fulfillment is really important, because it looks at a variety of things that we could take on over a protracted period of time. So it might be the case that there are certain things that we take on that may not be as enjoyable in the moment as eating a bowl of ice cream, but nonetheless are fulfilling. And when we look at it over a duration of time, we're really glad that we made that investment, even though it wasn't necessarily easy per se. It was worthwhile, right? And so it's worth interrogating our lives and saying, what are the things that we have done in our lives that have been the most fulfilling? And note those things, and don't judge them, just note them. And then one might have another list where one says, what are the things that have brought me the most joy in my life, whatever they are? And maybe it's reading books, maybe it's traveling, maybe it's relationships, maybe it's running. Maybe it's building businesses. It's idiosyncratic to every given individual. But if we all go back and interrogate our lives, we'll find things that brought us fulfillment and brought us joy. And then what we can do is we can extrapolate and we say, well, what are the sort of common denominators here? So for me, as an example, but this doesn't necessarily pertain to others, it's just how I'm built. There's a number of things that I've noticed that have brought me both joy and fulfillment. I love to study. I love to learn. That might be a bit apparent by the amount of degrees I have or how much time I've spent in academia. I also love to travel, and I travel quite frequently. And I've noticed that I've found my travels over long periods of time to consistently bring me joy as well as fulfillment. And so that's helped me then understand, as an example, that certain values like learning, like growth, like exploration seem to be consistently really important to me. And when I invest and double down in values such as learning and growth and exploration, I find that not only to be really fulfilling, but I find that to be authentic to me. And so I think that's just a great exercise we can all do at some interval basis, where we can just look at our lives and just be intellectually honest about what's working, what's not, and then what are the facets about the things that really light us up that we can then trace back to certain values that we have. And then you can find things sort of like poetry that rhyme with them. And that sort of helps as a basis for making choices.
I love that. And talking about learning and growth, you have gathered an impressive array of degrees and experiences across so many different fields. What advice would you have for our listeners who want to embrace lifelong learning in their own lives?
For me, it's always been a passion of mine. So first, it's a value of mine is learning and growth. And that was what we had just discussed a moment ago. So I had always known that that's something that brought me joy and fulfillment. Now, maybe objectively, a lot of people could look at that and say, yeah, that's a great thing. Lifelong learning is great. But there's other things that are great. And maybe other people look at things that I don't do and find more fulfillment and growth in that and decide, well, that's my core value. But for me, it's always resonated. And, I could go back, and my father's a professor and my mother's a teacher. So perhaps I grew up in an environment that really valued education and that was inculcated into me at a young age. But, ever since I was young, I was someone who was just always fascinated by the world around me and always had a deep curiosity to understand how things worked. And I did my undergraduate degree in electrical engineering and then went into medicine and ultimately got a PhD and got a couple of business degrees as well. And all of those degrees were driven by an curiosity to understand something. So much so that I gave a lot less consideration to how practical the degrees were per se. It was a bit better part of me when I was an undergrad that would have rather majored in philosophy or physics than engineering. But it was always a curiosity about the world. How does this work? Why is this the way that it is? And that was something that always drove me. And, my advice to others is to allow your sense of curiosity, your passion, as to drive you more than anything else, because it's really that positive motivation that I think allows lifelong learning to be, rather than be a cumbersome process, to actually be something that's enriching.
I fully agree. It's extremely enriching. And talking now about your academic roles, you teach at Stanford, Harvard, and MIT. What advice do you find yourself giving most often to the young generation of future leaders?
So I'm really blessed to have affiliations with all three of those institutions, and I greatly enjoy interacting with students at all levels, from undergraduate to graduate students and postgraduate students, as well as faculty. And one of the observations that I have amongst these students is they're extraordinarily capable. They don't get to those places by not being capable and not doing impressive things in their young lives. It's really humbling just to be able to interact with them and learn from them. One of I think the biggest challenges that they have to face is really two interrelated things. Number one is learning how to make mistakes and realizing that it's okay. Because amongst the characteristics of a lot of these kids going to Harvard, MIT, and Stanford is, as an example, whether they take the ACT or SAT standardized tests, they tend to either miss like 1 point or no points, right? And they were told and understood and were lived under an environment where that was what drove their success. And they publish these things. Our students have a 4.00 average GPA and they have a perfect ACT score and they're perfect in every which way. And we actively screen against people who have struggled in any way that would impact any academic thing, right? So, God forbid, in ninth grade, as you're working your way through life, you got a couple B's here and there, right? Like those are, criteria which, maybe are being forgiven by some institutions, but there are others that are just so selective and have so many people who have, been perfect or near perfect that it's really hard to have slipped too much in your young life and get to that level. But the challenge is there's so much of that reinforcement of having to deliver perfection in everything that you do that it creates a risk aversion. And ultimately what ends up happening is people don't want to take things on that they might fail at, that they might not get an A on, or even worse, that they might never be good at. maybe they keep on getting C's at it or D's at it. And then they have to realize like, after all that punishment, they went down the wrong road, but you don't really know. And so, but in the end analysis, for me, that's where all of my success has come, is the willingness to take on challenges where I didn't get it right the first time or the second time or the third time. And then maybe you sort of were on the right track the fourth time, but you have to go to tactic 2 and 3 and 4. And that's the path to success in life. At least that's the path that I've taken, right? Like I'm not the person who just did everything perfect off the bat and gee whiz, I'm so smart. And that's where I've gotten to where I was. And so it's really that tension between what it took for these kids to get to where they are and what was expected of them. But on the flip side, it turns out that really doesn't generally work in life, and it really limits their ability to succeed in the long term because you have to completely change your behavior and your risk tolerance and your appetite for failure and getting bad grades or bad feedback in order to sort of take that next leap of growth in your life. And that's really the biggest challenge they face.
And I absolutely love what you have just shared about the risk aversion. And I want to now connect the dots with what you do in the venture capital world, right? Where you're now actually dealing primarily with individuals that actually are embracing risk, are loving it, right? Because starting a venture, a business, a startup has infinite challenges that comes with it. And I was curious to learn what has transpired as a result of your activities in the VC world. And what have you learned from some of these entrepreneurs? And what is ultimately your definition of success in this world?
So to provide a little context, which you've done an excellent job of, I'm the founder and CEO of Northpond Ventures, which is a multi-billion-dollar science-driven venture capital firm. We currently have about 60 businesses. We either lead or co-lead virtually all our businesses and sit on the board of directors of. We often build these businesses de novo, but oftentimes we'll also support businesses in their early stage and help them grow and develop. And our focus is on science-driven venture capital. And in that respect, first and foremost, it's important to understand we're a mission-driven organization. So that really drives what we do. And the philosophy and belief that we have is that we can develop and empower breakthrough science and instantiate it within the vehicle of entrepreneurship to impact humanity in profound ways. And that is our goal. That is our aspiration. So you asked about what our barometer for success is. That's our barometer of success. Can we develop new science? And can we then translate that new science into a new company vehicle such that we can then take that product, that vehicle, that company, and create impactful tools that can promote human health and well-being. And as you might imagine, that's not a trivial exercise. And, we run academic facilities, as we previously discussed, at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford, where we work with other leading scientists to come up with new constructs and develop it and build businesses around it. And the appetite for risk has to be pretty high, and the appetite for you want to call it failure or iteration. It's entirely, a subjective moniker. You know, I'm fine calling it failure, but we see it as iteration because we just keep on going. So failure has a certain finality to it, where iteration says, well, okay, that didn't work, but we're going to wake up tomorrow and go at it again or try something different. So there's always pivots in iteration in our industry. But what I've learned along the way is a number of things. One is I love working with people who are on a mission. It's just an entirely different experience as opposed to people who just have a job or just, nothing wrong with trying to make ends meet. I fully appreciate that. I have a family and we all have those responsibilities, but, we work with people who believe in the sort of the genius of the and rather than the tyranny of the or, who want to do something that they truly deeply believe in and they want to make it, successful commercially. And, for us, it's first who, then what. So it's working with people who are, and the key word for us is aligned. That's really what we look for. It's not an indictment of, are they good? Are they not good? Or, so on and so forth. We're not value judging. We're just looking for people who are good fits for what we do and who are intellectually and ideologically aligned with the way that we do things. And so we screen for that. And it, as you might imagine, it requires a certain disposition to want to take on these exercises. And, I'm a huge proponent of entrepreneurship, but it's not for everyone. And so, we really want to make sure that the people we're partnered with really have the wherewithal and the mindset necessary to endure the challenges they'll face along the way, because there will be many. And I've been involved in over 100 businesses and I've seen all sorts of outcomes and scenarios, and just want to make sure that we're partnered with people who really embrace that journey.
And while there's so much excitement and opportunities when it comes to entrepreneurship, studies also indicate that about 50% of entrepreneurs are tackling various mental health issues because of the strain that they put on themselves. What advice would you have for those entrepreneurs that have these brilliant visions and passions? So while they bring those ideas to life, that they do not forget about their mental health.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic and important question. And if, you'll allow me, I would broaden that and say that's a challenge that I see pervasively. I see it in our academic community. You go to certain institutions that I teach at, and there are just posters pasted all over the wall of imposter syndrome hotlines. So that's an interesting challenge that people who actually get into some of these elite institutions and enroll in them, is most of them don't feel worthy of it, right? They have this sense that everyone else around them is better or smarter or more capable, and somehow they got in, but they shouldn't have. And then the first mistake that they make, which they've generally their first mistake because they didn't make very many to get into the place to begin with, then it triggers this imposter syndrome. And what I talked about earlier about failure, the biggest issue with it, and imposter syndrome is just one manifestation, is the mental toll that it takes and all the negative talk that people have, and then all the conclusions they draw about who they are or what they're capable of based on an outcome, right?
Yeah.
Which intellectually you hear ourselves say that and you say, well, yeah, it seems pretty intuitive that people shouldn't be doing this, but they don't. And so then the question becomes whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're a student at one of these institutions or whether you're a fellow traveler on this world, how do we contend with the inevitable challenges? And that comes down to certain learned skills. I think self-compassion is an incredibly important one. Life is really, really difficult if you can't find compassion for yourself. There's lots of things in life that I will tell you are optional. I'm passionate about them, and there's things that meaningful to me, but, self-compassion is sort of one of those things that I don't see a lot of people who live really healthy, fulfilling lives that can't find compassion for themselves. And so, that's just tool and a skill that we all need to be mindful to build. And there's all sorts of ways to exercise that. And, that's a whole longer conversation, but that's really critical. It's also important, as we discussed earlier, to recognize plan A usually doesn't work. So much so that I actually often think to myself, it doesn't even matter what my plan A is. It just matters that I come up with something and do something and get feedback, and then figure out what we do with that feedback. Because oftentimes, I'm just prepared that there's going to have to be an iteration to plan B and C. And as long as we have the acuity to see what's happening, intellectual honesty to assess it appropriately, and the willingness to take action relative to that feedback, then more likely than not, we'll ultimately get there. And so really that paradigm, I think, is just tremendously critical for entrepreneur. It's not about plan A or even necessarily plan B. You have to be compassionate with yourself, and peer groups help a lot just in general. Find other people who are going through the same thing. I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen both in academia and entrepreneurship, which really hurts people, is they presume that they're alone. And that's really dangerous. They think that they are uniquely challenged and that they are facing risks that are totally idiosyncratic to them, right? Everyone naturally successful the first time, and and they look at everyone else's Instagram accounts and they see their lives are all perfect. So they presume that they're just that, rare human being that came out, imperfect. And, so finding peer groups who are going through similar things is also really critical.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I fully agree. Self-compassion is so, so essential. And as I think about your kids, I know you mentioned earlier that you have 3 kids. How do you instill in them the importance of self-compassion and other core values so they can thrive and live with joy?
That's such a wonderful question. And it's a question that I ask myself every day. And it's a question that I haven't fully mastered or answered, but it's one of those things that is, you continue to challenge yourself to get better. Hopefully over time, you do better tomorrow than you did today. But it was an evolutionary process for me. My oldest son is a senior in high school. He's 17-year-old. I have a daughter who's a freshman in high school, and then a 10-year-old on the younger end. And, what I've learned as a parent is many things, but number one is each kid is unique and they have their own aspirations and strengths and personalities and proclivities. And my initial instinct was, well, here's my values. They're the right ones because they're mine, and I'm the parent. So I get to be the arbiter of rectitude. And so those are right. And then they've worked for me. Right. And I've done all these amazing things in my life, and I've been incredibly blessed, and I've done it as a product of doing things a certain way. And so then you try to inculcate these things into your kids because you mean well and you want to see them thrive and you want to see them succeed. And you want their lives, to be joyful, right, and fulfilling. And then, what you learn along the way, and maybe most people learn this quicker than I did, so I'm not saying I was a quick study here, but you learn they're all different. And so then what you have to do is you have to actually first seek to understand before you really take too many steps towards trying to drive them in a given direction. And it's kind of like teaching, where each student is unique and they learn differently. And kids are the same way. But if you can tap into their potential, their unique potential as individuals, and understand their ethos and what drives them, and rather than sort of merely guiding from your values, you're really understanding what would motivate them and what would excite them and what works for them. That's a lot healthier. And the other thing that I would sort of add to that, which I've learned, and it really dovetails with other things that we've been talking about throughout the thread, is this concept of risk. And one of the biggest challenges I have as a parent, and I suspect I'm not alone in this, is we hate to see our kids fail. We hate to see our kids fall off the bike, or or strive to have a certain relationship that doesn't go their way, or take a class and not get the grade they want, and it's just viscerally painful as a parent. And so we try to do everything we possibly can, or at least I do, to bubble wrap them and to do as much as we can for them to prevent them from experiencing any strife in this world. And because we feel like there's enough of that already, and whatever we can do to create a soft landing and create joy and eliminate worry, boy, isn't that great. But what you learn is a couple things. One is there's no way to eliminate all of that. No matter how well you do, there's going to be things where they're going to skin their knee, they're going to fall off the bike, they're going to make mistakes. And that's not only okay, it's actually the best way for them to learn and grow. And we don't need to buy or prescribe into this notion of either perfectionism or the notion that they need to do everything right or everything needs to be easy, right? That's hard for me. I don't want to see any of my kids struggle on anything. And I want to make everything, as easy as possible for them and provide them every possible support. But, sometimes what they really need is to just struggle with something, or just try to do it the wrong way and learn viscerally what it feels like to fail, so that, they can have that experience to draw upon the next time. And that sort of commonality to entrepreneurship, to parenting, to my own life, is sort of that need to learn how to fail and have self-compassion and take risks and try again.
Love that. So beautiful. And Mike, you're also doing so many other things beyond everything we have already discussed. You're also a marathon runner and a martial artist. How have these physical pursuits shaped your mental approach to business and leadership?
That we are an integrated whole as it relates to our physical selves, our mental selves, our spiritual selves, and our emotional selves. And I think in the end analysis, when we look at our foundation, if our foundation isn't whole, it's really hard to show up for ourselves, let alone to others. And oftentimes, if I'm not performing well in something in my life, even if it seems really far derived from anything relating to, emotional well-being, I could usually go back and say, you know what, if my spiritual and emotional grounding was a lot better in that moment, or I had done a better job sort of stabilizing myself and setting the intention that morning, I probably would have handled that situation better, even though it's not apparent in the moment that was the cause of it. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm a big believer in having routines that support me across all 4 different facets. So, the facet that you had just asked about was the physical facet. And, to each individual, it's a unique choice that we all make as to what resonates with us. For me, I don't know what it is about my body or how my mind works, but I love long distance running. It's pretty much the first thing I do every morning when I get up. Get out of my bed, I brush my teeth, and then I go for my run. And it does a lot for me. It's a physical activity, so it rejuvenates my body, but it also enables me to think clearly. And so oftentimes when I run in the morning, it's when I solve most of the challenging things that I'm trying to figure out. Is actually not sitting at a desk at my computer. It's actually running. That's when I get the most insights. And I'm also getting that physical exercise. But it's also a tremendous spiritual and emotional feeling, because I run in a path and there's water and trees and nature, and it's beautiful and it's rejuvenating. And I experience the seasons because I run throughout all 4 seasons. So it gives me a sense of the sort of cycles, and I could feel the heat or feel the cold or feel the rain. I run in the rain too. So, to me, it's just a fully immersive, spiritual, emotional, mental, physical experience that gets my day off in the right way. And I like to start with a win. If nothing else goes right for the rest of the day, at least I had that run in. And it goes back to what we talked about, which is this notion of what your values are and what brings you joy and what brings you fulfillment. And that's what I looked at. I tried other things. I was like, I don't either enjoy that, and I didn't find it particularly fulfilling. Other people love it, right? And then when I did running, it was just check those two boxes.
Now you've given me the desire to run. I exercise also like you in the morning. I truly, truly believe in the power of exercising in the morning. And like you, I feel it sets you up for the day. And there's actually science that indicates how productive you can actually be and how more focused you can be as a result of exercising in the morning. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope it inspires some of our listeners to also begin a similar routine.
Um,
Since we've spoken a lot about joy, I was wondering if you would be able to summarize if joy would have a recipe, what would be the three main ingredients that it would contain?
that's such a beautiful question and such an important one. You know, to me, the ingredients would be as follows. Um, One ingredient for me would be authenticity, because I have seen, both for myself as well as my kids and my wife and my peers and colleagues, I've seen them do highly disparate things and derive joy from things that I actually actively seek not to do. Right. And they're like, no, like that's how, like, my wife is not a runner. She doesn't understand how I could possibly derive joy from running, 26.2 miles, but I do. And so to me, it starts with a deep sense of authenticity, of knowing who you are and what inspires you and what fulfills you, and not to be overly levered to what others expect of you or what society expects of you, or even necessarily what others derive joy from. It might be a source of curiosity to see whether it resonates with you, but it's really hard to experience joy if what you're doing is highly inauthentic to you, right? Like, most people I experience in joy are doing things that are in inauthenticity as well. So that would be one of the three ingredients. The second one, and it's a cousin of joy, but it's distinct, and so it's worth mentioning, and it's important to me, is passion. I'm a huge proponent of passion. It's what allows me to persevere through challenges, because ultimately, we all have our limits to how much we're able or willing to push through when we face challenges. And it's often our passion for what we do that allows us to endure in the case of perseverance. But it's also that passion that allows us to have that degree of joy, right? So I am extremely passionate about learning. I am passionate about physics, and my family enjoys teasing me about it, because, physics isn't typically how most people derive joy. Some of us do, but it's you take a survey, it's not high on the list, but it's high on my list. And I'm passionate about physics, and because I'm passionate about it, it's easy for me to derive joy from it. And so follow your passions. What are those things that your passions? I don't know. Is it running? Is it learning? Is it meditation? Is it friendships? Chances are, not lurking far behind your passions are things that will bring you joy. And conversely, if you spend a whole bunch of time doing things that you're not passionate about, it just it really creates a much higher bar for sort of experiencing joy. And then the third thing that I would mention, and we've talked a bit about it, and again, these words, they sound a little bit like joy, but they're distinct. And so it's important, I think, to understand that distinction, as at least for me, which is this notion of fulfillment, which is a really interesting counterpart to joy, because sometimes there's a time element, right? And so this is sort of notion of the long now, right? Like, how do we even define the now, right? What is it? Is now a millisecond long? Is it a second long? Is it 5 minutes long? Is it a generation long? And the reality is, we oftentimes need to also ask ourselves, what will we find fulfilling over the longer now to sort of reinforce that joy. Because, one might find it's sort of the simplistic analogy, but I'll use it because we used it earlier, sort of like eating a bowl of ice cream, right? Where, and there's nothing wrong with ice cream. I love ice cream. And there's, I would assert there's a time and a place to eat ice cream without a doubt. And it can be a very enjoyable experience, right? And so all of that is true. But then one might ask, well, why is one doing anything other than eating ice cream, right? And, the answer would be in part, well, it may not be particularly fulfilling to do nothing but eat ice cream, even though there's sort of joy in that moment. And so, to me, in order to have any degree of sustainable joy in the sort of long now beyond just sort of the moment of that particular instant, is to also ask yourself the question of, will I also find this fulfilling? And, and that creates different genres of joy, which other people may look at and be like, you really enjoyed solving that physics problem, or, you really found joy in that run. And, the reality is, yeah, when I zoom out and I look at it holistically, I did. But, there were moments along that run where if you asked me to zoom in on that particular second where like, yeah, it was hard, maybe I wouldn't want the whole run to be like that. And so just also asking ourselves that fulfillment question, I think, is really important.
And if you had the opportunity to write a message that would be put in a time capsule that would be opened by someone, let's just say 100 years from now, what would be one key message that you may want to share with future generations?
There are so many great answers to that, if you ask me that, multiple different times, I'm sure I would answer it differently each time. But, the way I'll answer it this time, because I think there's value in being thematic about our discussion and sort of reinforcing some of the things that we've said to have some degree of consistency, is to encourage people to have the courage to pursue the things that they're truly passionate about and brings them joy. And when they face the inevitable challenges along the way, and when things don't quite turn out each and every time the way they want them to have self-compassion and to realize it's okay.
I was wondering if you could also share with us one of the best advices that you have ever received from someone, and how has that helped you navigate life?
God, I've been a tremendous beneficiary of extraordinary mentorship from so many people who've taught me so much. And just that whole construct of mentorship is one that I'm a huge proponent of, both in terms of me having extraordinary mentors in my life, as well as trying to do my part in being mentors to other people, which we have an internship and fellowship program at our firm, which we run out of our office in Harvard Square. And, we bring a lot of undergraduate and graduate students there to mentor them. And obviously we talked about my teachings, but to answer the question explicitly, one of our dear friends and colleagues is a gentleman by the name of Jim Collins, who's a best-selling author. He wrote the book Good to Great, amongst others, Built to Last. And we had him actually do an event at our firm here at Northpond once. He did a fireside chat with us, and we greatly enjoyed him. And, one of the things that he exhorts people to consider is the following. He says, we all get lucky in life at times. Each and every one of us have had moments in time where we've gotten luck. But my question to you is, what is your return on luck? And that, to me, is a really powerful quote that I think a lot about, because we are all fortunate in so many ways that we can enumerate. And we can all think of things that we're grateful for that we have that life didn't necessarily owe us, or other people don't have. I certainly feel that way. So we're all fortunate. And when we look around us, we're actually far more fortunate than we realize, because there's all these amazing opportunities and resources at our disposal that we could avail ourselves of to do all sorts of extraordinary things. And so the question that he asks is not whether we are lucky or when we will find ourselves in a position of luck, but how do we get a return on luck? And that, it was really Jim Collins that sort of inspired me then, to ask this very same kind of type of question about our potential and this concept of return on potential. Because what I realized is we all have tremendous potential to do extraordinary things. And so the ultimate question becomes not whether we have potential, but how do we get the best return on our potential? I'm an investment professional amongst other things. And so we think about things like return on invested capital, right? What's our proceeds relative to capital invested? And it's not actually a bad construct to think about life in general, including luck and including potential, is how do we maximize our return for all these tremendous gifts that life has given us?
Beautiful. I absolutely love this conversation, Mike. I'm so grateful for all the wisdom you have shared and all your experiences. It has brought me a lot of joy, and I hope it has brought a lot of joy for our listeners as well. So thank you immensely.
Thank you, Andrea. It's been a pleasure to be on the show. I greatly enjoyed our conversation.